Hello, folks. Welcome to Inside the Marble Palace, Postmedia's look at Saskatchewan politics this week. I'm Murray Mandrick. I'm the legislative columnist for the Regina Leader Post and Saskatoon Star Phoenix. With me, as always, Arthur White-Crummy, who is our legislative reporter. Hi, Arthur. How you doing, buddy?
Good to see you. And
good. It is good to be back. And joining us, Adam, familiar face, Adam Hunter, CBC Provincial Affairs reporter in Saskatchewan. Hi, Adam.
Hi, guys. We're in unfamiliar setting for the recording here. All in our offices, we're like 20 feet or less from each other, but our doors are closed. We're following all the protocols.
So purely her.
Well, I wanted to be in the chamber. But somebody ratted me out. I won't mention names, but let's talk about the throw-in speech this week, guys, and highs and lows, because I thought there was a fair bit of both in terms of this throw-in speech. 25 pages is an awful lot of ground to cover, and they covered we'll start with you, Arthur. Your highs, your lows for what kind of surprised you about the throw-in speech, and maybe what disappointed you about throw-in speech day.
Yeah, so to start with the substance of the speech itself, I don't think it was that surprising, because Scott Moe had telegraphed at least what the main points were going to be during his speech to the Saskatoon Chamber of Commerce that was sponsored by Nutrien. Have to say that. He said it was going to be about crime. There was an unacceptable crime rate in certain parts of the province, in his view, and further, it was going to be a lot about economic development and promoting growth. Those were kind of the two main planks, and we saw that in the throw-in speech itself. There were a lot of concrete measures to fight very sort of like niche elements of crime. So there was like a trafficking team. There's a team to crack down on people with outstanding warrants, and there's going to be 60 new police officers that are going to be hired to actually staff these things. So that pretty much was in keeping with what we were expecting to some degree. On the economic growth, it was very, very familiar territory, right? It was they're going to expand this tax credit that they have for agricultural value added. This is really kind of a sort of persistent thing for the Sask party, so there was nothing surprising there either. What was perhaps a bit more surprising was what we saw in the circumstances surrounding the throne speech. So obviously we had a rather large protest just out front that was opposing public health measures. And we saw for the first time Nadine Wilson, who was ejected or resigned from the Sask Party caucus because of some disagreements over her vaccination status. She was actually the headline attraction of that protest. She spoke, she encouraged the people there, she said that she was going to work for them, and I'm sure that we'll have more to say about her role in the coming legislative session later on in our chat. You're muted, Murray.
We'll get that in. Well, let's talk about that, Adam, because we just finished a scrum with Ms. Wilson, and she basically, I think in more detail, outlined what her position is going to be and her role in the House as an independent member. What struck you as most interesting from what she had to say to reporters?
I think first of all, the fact that she basically resigned every position she had. She resigned as a member of the Saskatchewan Party. She resigned from the caucus. She resigned as deputy speaker. We had a new deputy speaker voted in today. It was going to be Joe Hargrave, former cabinet minister. And just to, piggyback on what Arthur was saying, I think, is positioning herself as this person who's speaking out for those who don't feel like they're represented in the current government. We know that everyone who's sitting, with the exception of Ms. Wilson, are fully vaccinated on both sides, on the opposition and government side. And so she sees herself as representing this, percentage of the population, of the adult population who's not vaccinated, and specifically people that are either maybe have even been vaccinated, but are against so-called vaccine mandates, or, she used the word today in the House and afterwards, coercion, that she feels that she's being bullied and being coerced into acting a certain way or having to be vaccinated to maintain her membership and sit on the floor And there was a motion today that I think she felt personally attacked by, that would have excluded her had the motion been successful from sitting on the floor, because the NDP was hoping to have it approved by all members that you had to be fully vaccinated. And the House Leader for the government, Jeremy Harrison, said it would set a dangerous precedent if there was a majority of members who could vote out or vote someone out of the House based on a number of different factors. She actually stood during the motion when the NDP was standing to vote. And in the press gallery, Arthur and I were sitting beside each other, and we kind of looked at each other and look, and Nadine Wilson standing up. Does she agree with the policy that's going to exclude her from the assembly? And she explained afterwards that she was trying to stand to make a point of order, but her microphone was cut off. She did say, I believe in democracy or something along those lines. She later, squared that with reporters afterwards. But it's going to be interesting to see how her role, just evolves through the sitting, because we haven't had, in my memory, and Murray, you're much, much older than Martha and I, and you probably have this experience, but we don't have the experience of someone who's independent, truly independent, sitting in the House and coming out and maybe offering different views, or even being allowed to speak during debate by the speaker to join in. So we'll have to see how that plays out. Nadine Wilson says she's had discussions about that with sides. It was also interesting, and while we're on the subject, to hear, and I asked her, do you think you represent people within the government caucus and your views? And she said, I won't get into the conversations I've had with them, but didn't say, I'm the only one that represents these views, or any sort of explanation of that. So I think she's portraying herself as someone who's getting a lot of attention. She mentioned Washington, D.C. She mentioned people from all over Saskatchewan calling her. So we'll have to see how this turns out. And Arthur, as Arthur mentioned, really remarkable to see her standing out there. We haven't seen a politician address anti-vax or anti-vaccine protesters in that sort of way throughout the pandemic, at least Saskatchewan government protesters, Saskatchewan government MLAs.
You were actually out there, Arthur, when she was there. And for some of those anti-vaxxers, it was kind of like meeting the Queen. I think she even gave a little bit of the Queen wave on the way in, or on the way out, if I remember that. Do you think she's kind of emboldened by the fact that she just recognizes that she has a constituency now that she didn't have before? And I'm wondering what impact that is going to have on the legislative proceedings itself. As Adam mentioned, the last time I think was in the late 90s when we had early 2000s when we had independent members, when the Liberal caucus imploded. And at that particular point, the MLA Jack Hilson, who was sort of the remaining independent Liberal, basically demanded a certain percentage of the questions as opposition leader. She can ask 1/13 of the questions in the legislature right now by virtue of precedent and rules. So what do you think, from what you heard of her today and talking to her yesterday and seeing the reaction, what do you think, Arthur, her impact will be on this particular fall sitting?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, she did seem legitimately energized by the rally yesterday. I mean, it is really something to go from being a backbench MLI who's really kind of always on the margins of what's going on in the legislature to somebody who's sort of the figurehead of a movement, however fringy it might be. She seems adamant that she wants to participate, that she sees herself as the representative of a strong constituency, even within her own riding. There's obviously some dispute about how much that might be the case, but I think that she feels like she's channeling a certain set of legitimate grievances into the public sphere, and that's not really something that we've seen. I mean, there's obviously a wide gulf between the NDP and the Saskatchewan Party on a lot of issues in terms of how to deal with the pandemic, but they're both on the same page in terms of the efficacy of vaccines, in terms of at least the basic science of this thing. So I think having that voice in there is gonna kind of shake things up, and is gonna make it difficult for us, because she is she is an MLA, but it's going to be hard for us to sort through some of these ideas, which in a lot of cases are not well grounded on the best evidence.
Well, Adam, what kind of headache does she create for Scott Moe, who obviously went into this session with a particular narrative, and that is that I did as much as was possible and reasonable without stepping on people's personal freedoms. I think he mentioned the word personal freedoms about 4 or 5 times today in question period in response to Ryan Miley. But yet I've done a fair bit in terms of, according to the Premier, in terms of putting forward policies that he argues have been effective and have reduced caseloads. I guess we'll get into whether the caseloads are really being reduced as much as the Premier claims they are, or whether that really means as much as the Premier claims they are. But I think this could, in a very real way, throw the Premier off that narrative that he actually has achieved middle ground in terms of this, based on some things that he hears from Nadine Wilson. It also might create a little bit of sympathy for the Premier in the sense of having someone to point to in the House each day and basically say, see, I am contending with a legitimate beef, a legitimate concern from the other side, not just the people that are screaming that we need to stop COVID by having more restrictions, but by I'm being pressured by people who are saying the restrictions are too much. What did you sense from the Premier this week in terms of where his game was at and whether these events have kind of thrown him off a bit?
I think that the focus today of the first question period was solely on recommendations and public health orders and doing more to lower the case number, to lower the hospitalization load, to limit the number of people that have to be sent to ICUs in Ontario. And that was the focus of the opposition today, specifically on asking what the recommendations from Dr. Shahab for specifically public health orders are, not just general public health recommendations. And the Premier has signaled, as early as before even he did the speech to the Chamber of Commerce, and then there was again mentioned in the government's throne speech, that they believe that the case numbers are dropping, that they believe that they're dropping significantly enough that what is in place right now is going to be sufficient. Not totally dismissing a letter from more than 20 medical health officers that has been, supported in some way or another by Dr. Shahab in some of the ideas of what the province could do to extend, measures. And, the Premier also, I think, has that to contend with more so probably than Nadine Wilson, who the thing that she has going for is, as I mentioned, she's the only public official, government official, MLA or opposition who has come out with this position so publicly. And now people have someone to contact, someone who's on the floor to express their views to that maybe they didn't think they had before. But every other member in the House, as I mentioned, is fully vaccinated. Every other member in the House, according to the government and the opposition, supports vaccines. That was echoed by Jeremy Harrison, the House leader for the government and the cabinet minister. So I think what the government has to contend with is that, what we're expecting to be a daily barrage of COVID questions and pandemic related questions from the opposition, which are going to have the Premier on his feet and the health minister on his feet on a daily basis.
Well, that's interesting, Arthur, because this week, for the first few days of the new sitting, I think the Premier found out that he was going to have to contend with COVID a lot more than he hoped. His whole State of the Province address to the Saskatoon Chamber of Commerce last Monday, and let's emphasize he was talking at Chamber of Commerce, so you somewhat expect a lot of business-related, economic development-related, tax-related questions and points to be made in that 36-minute speech. It was remarkably little, actually, how much he talked about COVID in that particular speech, and then had to talk to reporters later about it. Is this a big problem for a government that really wants to seize control not only of the COVID agenda and the narrative there, but almost to move away from it and start talking about other things. I can't see how this week went terribly well for Scott Moe in that particular regard because of Nadine Wilson, because of just the developments going forward. Is there an opportunity for him to move the conversation to something else this week, as he seemed to want to do this week by saying, well, caseloads are going down, so it's not as big a problem?
Yeah, well, he's certainly going to try, and I think that the throne speech was as guilty of that as the Chamber of Commerce speech. I mean, there was some acknowledgement in the throne speech of the situation in hospitals and the pressures that the fourth wave has been putting on ICUs, but there weren't really any concrete measures in the throne speech about how to deal with that. That being said, I mean, that's not traditionally what a throne speech would be for. It's more about legislation. It's more about perhaps a few spending items that you might want to have before the budget. But it's also a chance to signal priorities. And you didn't get the sense reading that throne speech that COVID-19 was a top priority. You would have gotten the sense that crime was a top priority, which may be true in a typical year, but is probably not true now. It's at least not on the same level in most people's minds, I don't believe. And I think what we saw over the last 2 days is it's not going to be as easy for him to evade that reality in the midst of a legislative session where he has to face the opposition and the media every day, as it has been over the past several weeks, where at times it has seemed as though both the premier and some of his ministers have been ducking the cameras.
Well, it's interesting. I agree with you in terms of him not wanting overall to be talking about COVID every day or every moment, and the throne speech reflected that. I actually thought, though, Adam, that they paid enough attention in the throne speech to, under other circumstances, to pay enough attention to COVID to afford them the opportunity to move on if the opportunity presented itself. But as Arthur says, despite their willingness to want to talk about crime, despite their willingness to want to talk about, of all things, equalization, that Lord knows no one ever wants to talk about, they were still trapped in the COVID thing. What about any of these other agenda items forward, as Arthur suggested? Can any of them catch fire as to something to capture the public imagination? Or does this government not get that until it provides answers to COVID in either reduced ICU cases, reduced fatalities related to COVID, it's going to just have to contend with it? That's the part that I'm struggling with, is why the government just doesn't meet the issue more head on and say, yeah, we're on top of this and we're going to be doing a few more things. I don't know what that necessarily means, a 28-day restriction on household gatherings, as was suggested by the CMOs, but it didn't seem, from what we're hearing from Scott Moe today, that he saw much need to go any further, as suggested by the doctors. Does he actually think that he can actually move on without too much damage?
I think this has been the as Arthur said, with not hearing from ministers or the premier for some weeks. He did a bit of a media tour a couple of weeks ago, where the message we were hearing now is a similar message that he was telling people a couple of weeks ago, which is the trajectory is better. It is a challenging time, but as long as this fourth wave is kind of looming, the government's going to get blamed for its existence in the province, and the fact that it's been statistically the worst province to be hit by the fourth wave. You could make an argument for Alberta, obviously, but in the recent weeks, Saskatchewan's led in death rates, case rates. We're the only province airlifting patients out to another province, and I think just the throne speech data to me was so remarkable in a number of ways. We've already talked about the protest. Before, you had another protest about people who want changes to social assistance, and they're on the front lawn of the legislature. Their kind of protest stops, and they're sort of overtaken, or it's overlapped by this second protest about vaccine mandates. Meanwhile, inside, you're welcoming guests in for the first time. And these guests are coming through this whole pomp and ceremony of the throne speech and the lieutenant governor. They'll all have to be vaccinated and masked or have a negative test, but we're filling the floor of the assembly. We have, all the justices there. We have a full gallery for the first time of visitors. And all this is happening while outside you have people very angry, chanting for the premier to come out because they don't like the vaccination mandates. And simultaneously at CBC, we had our photographer in Toronto taking photos on the tarmac of an air ambulance from Saskatchewan unloading an ICU patient from a gurney into an ambulance. I don't know how you can change the channel on all of those things happening at the same time. And then yesterday, or I should say, you know, the day of the throne speech, Paul Merriman comes out for a scrum. All the ministers were coming out for scrums as were normally happen here in the rotunda. And there's this crush of people, you know, filtering in and out of the gallery and out of the assembly, going to a reception, you know, where there's tea and hors d'oeuvres and things handed out as typically would happen in a normal year. And you're kind of struck by the juxtaposition of all the things that are happening at once in this province and outside of this province now that all have to do in some way with COVID. Those people are all having to wear masks. They're only there because they're vaccinated. It's very remarkable the time that we're in right now. And the moment that happened during the throne speech, I don't think we've seen anything like it. And that's probably why the government's not going to be able to just say, okay, hey, we have a crime reduction strategy. We have an addiction strategy. We have an investment and growth strategy. All those things, you know, in any normal year would get tons of attention, and they'd get media attention. They'd get the attention of the public. They would debate the merits of either of those things. And all the investment in the government that the premier touts that's coming to the province is all good, and people would be championing that. But it's hard when you have this backdrop of all the things that are going on and coming at the government. And the last thing I'll say is we also have in the House, you know, always a dispute of the facts, and between the NDP and the government, what the opposition wants, what they're actually calling for, which you have to ask them because it's not always clear, and what the doctors may want, and what the government thinks is prudent. And I think that's going to be the tug of war and the push and pull that we're going to be having continually over the next 5 weeks or so.
It's going to be fascinating. I wish we had more time to talk about today. We didn't even get into equalization, and you know how I love to talk about equalization. Thanks very much for joining us this week, Adam and Arthur. It'll be an interesting couple of weeks, couple more weeks until early December when the sessions is ended, or the sitting is ended until before the spring budget. And I think we're going to hear a little bit more on COVID. I'm pretty sure you're right on that. Guys, Adam, Arthur, good job as usual. Thanks so much, and we'll see you next time on Inside the Marble Palace.
Murray, go get me a coffee. I'm just down the hall.
Okay, Shell, I will. It's very bad coffee.
Thanks, guys.
See you guys soon.